All right, we're going to start with a disclaimer. We're not saying that trauma is not a real thing or that you should unlearn everything you've learned about trauma, but we're going to be poking some holes in how it's applied, some of the definitions, just some of the problems with trauma in general. So, going back to the Trauma Myth book, which I got and read, I found some interesting information, specifically how the feminist movement took childhood sexual abuse and latched it onto the trauma concept, but I thought it highlighted some interesting things. So, prior to sexual abuse being called trauma, I found there was a lot of blaming the victim. So, starting with Freud, he kind of denied. At first, he was like, "Okay, yeah, it's legit. You're recounting something real," but later on, he decided that everybody wasn't telling the truth, and this was due to the fact that they didn't resolve the Oedipal complex, right? So from there until the time that it latched onto the trauma concept, there was a lot of blaming the victim. There was this idea of sex delinquents, as if the children were enticing, seducing their perpetrators. People didn't believe it happened so frequently. So there was all this going on. And some quotes, it was harmless in normal children. It might be due to pre-existing psychological symptoms. So if sexual abuse caused problems, people were like, it was already there. So the feminist movement caught on to this, and they're like, this isn't happening. We need to do something about it. And with the official diagnosis of PTSD, the emergence of trauma as a concept, they actually took that and latched it onto their agenda. So feminist movement latched onto trauma concept to move away from blaming victims. So what they did was take this sexual abuse, called it trauma, when in fact the definition might not fit. So not all children reported that the abuse was traumatic, so to speak. But there were similarities in the symptoms, so they took it and ran with it. So there's some political backing to the whole thing that helps solidify it as a concept. So everybody hears about trauma now, right? These guys are going to elaborate on some of these things a little bit more, but this is what emerged, and yeah, it's just everywhere now. It's a pretty solid concept, and a lot of people don't question it. I like to call it the trauma gospel. So it's, like I said, it's everywhere. If you've heard of the ACE study, adverse childhood experiences, kind of got some broad terms to define it. So some would be parental mental illness, parental substance abuse, parental incarceration as traumatic experiences. Also historical trauma, the unresolved grief that comes from previous generations. So that's kind of one loosely applied trauma term. So not sure how that fits. Trauma-informed care. A kid loses his phone. Trump gets elected. Everyone's calling everything trauma now, right? Mm-hmm. So just not sure if it always applies. Problems with challenging the concept. So if you come up and say, all right, trauma is not real, trauma doesn't fit everywhere, sometimes you get a lot of feedback like, oh, you're not saying these children had a traumatic experience. So you're going up against a vulnerable population, maybe even the veteran population. So some appeal to emotion, appeal to pity, slippery slope, black and white thinking. It's just, you don't touch it, or you get all this poor reasoning coming back at you. So, all right, going into the definition, DSM-3, some really vague definition up there. So, a recognizable stressor evoking significant symptoms of distress in almost everyone. Outside the range of usual human experience. So again, there's some subjective type things, and can't be universally applied. So what your idea of a usual human experience might be super different from mine. So again, keep in mind all the research was based on these definitions. A revision here, event outside the range of usual human experience, and that would be markedly distressing to almost anyone. So what's distressing to you might not be so distressing to me. Again, emerging concept, trouble with defining. DSM-4, I won't do that one. DSM-5, this is our current one. So there's a real narrowing of, this is criterion A in DSM. I like it because it makes it a little bit more measurable, it makes the studies more valid. It's a universal concept. But now it's exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. And then there's some qualifiers down there. But the problem with that is with the narrow concept, narrow definition, is again, it's applied everywhere. So makes you think about the interventions that are formed. Take something like trauma-informed care and figuring out if this definition really fits. This is SAMHSA definition. I really like it. I think it's similar to everybody else's definition about trauma. So individual trauma results from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So from this very narrow term to this very broad term in general. So difficult to quantify, measure. If you're doing scientific studies on it, some of it is subjective, especially the older definition. There's variations in severity and adverse symptoms, so there's just all this difficulty measuring this thing. And in the end, validity, reliability, I won't explain it. I know I've gone over my time, but yeah, there you go.
So now a lot of behavioral healthcare providers have adopted this whole trauma model, and we've decided that, like, if anything is wrong with you as an adult, you probably experienced some form of trauma. So the trauma model is based on psychological trauma is a key causal factor in the development of many psychiatric illnesses. So as we're treating people, we're trained, okay, beware, everyone you're working with probably has some sort of trauma, and you need to be careful of it. The issue with this is that all the studies that underlie this belief are actually kind of weak. So all the studies, people have looked at groups of people who have mental illness and substance abuse issues, and they have determined, well, all these people seem to also have some sort of traumatic experience. They've experienced something that could be traumatic. But it's all correlation. So all these studies are saying, oh, we found an association, we found a link, we found a correlation. There's no real causation that's been discovered. We're simply saying, hey, we've identified that most people with mental health problems have had some sort of traumatic event. But no cause has really been identified, and as we've learned, correlation doesn't actually prove anything. So it's a pretty invalid argument to begin with. And so now from this belief, everyone who steps foot into a behavioral health agency is going to be given the ACE tool, and we're going to ask you 10 questions to determine if you had a difficult childhood. And the ACE tool assesses for abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction that you may or may not have experienced from ages 0 to 18 growing up at home. And we say, oh, if you score a certain score on the ACE, well, then something is definitely wrong with you, and you need to make a therapy referral right now, because if this has happened to you, you could be exhibiting any of these behaviors. And these are the behaviors that are deemed to be linked with adverse childhood experiences. And if you look at it, I think some of them are kind of ridiculous, like diabetes. I'm pretty sure science and medicine has figured out where diabetes comes from, and I don't think your parents telling you what I meant. It's actually sort of a medical thing. And broken bones. I mean, I know a lot of people who have broken bones that can score a 0 on the ACE. And so we've kind of taken this theory of if something bad happened to you when you're a kid, everything that bad happens to you as an adult is a result of that, and we just really run with it. And maybe the umbrella has become too broad. So this is the theory of childhood trauma. This is the pyramid. This is from psychiatrictimes.org. It's also in a ton of psychology and psychiatry and social work journals and textbooks. So if you experience something adverse as a child, you're going to have disrupted neurodevelopment. You're going to, have conflict in resolving your stages, and something's going to go wrong in your development, and then you're going to develop some sort of impairment, social, emotional, cognitive, or all of the above. Then you're going to pick up risky behaviors. then you're going to have some sort of disability or social problem or disease. Something's going to be wrong with you because this happened, and then it's going to end in early death. So basically, if anything happened to you that was negative as a child, you're going to die early, and you should accept that. The problem with this is that it's really psychodynamic in nature. So it's kind of rooted in this belief that, like, oh, everything develops as a child, and you have to process through these steps and resolve all your stages, and if you can't do that successfully, well, then you're just kind of screwed, and you're not going to be a healthy adult. But this is pretty unsubstantiated at this point. Like, most people and professionals agree that Freud's theories and things like that are pretty unsupported. These are some quotes from an introduction to psychology textbook, like the most basic level psychology course you can take is agreeing that Freud was kind of a quack, and we can't even be sure that Erik Erikson's stages of theories are valid. There's really no proof that the stages of development are valid, and that if something goes wrong with them, you're screwed as an adult. It's not true. But anyways, we've taken it and run with it, and we've decided trauma is everywhere, and we must always be on the lookout for it, and we must always be vigilant to treat it. And so a group of people got together in Connecticut and developed the New Haven trauma competencies, and there's a whole list of them. I just picked out a few because I thought it was so interesting how they use the word trauma in these tools to care for people, like demonstrate the ability to appropriately appreciate, assess, and incorporate trauma survivors' strengths, resilience, and potential for growth in all domains. So if you teach someone to do that as they go into work, I'm going to walk into an office and sit down with someone and say, here to find the strengths of this trauma survivor. But if I'm looking at a trauma survivor in my mind, I'm going to find all the trauma. So we're really developing a confirmation bias here that if we're looking for trauma, we're going to find it. And really, if we had gone back and just said, hey, it's important to demonstrate the ability to appreciate, assess, and incorporate your client's strengths and resiliencies, then you're gonna see the person as who they are and not just be looking for trauma. And this is really important because if we're looking for trauma, we're going to find it when it may not exist, and that can actually be pretty detrimental. For example, in New York after 9/11, a bunch of psychologists decided, oh my gosh, everyone's going to be so traumatized from this event. We have to care for people's trauma because this was a horrible thing and people are going to be wrecked. And so they developed these programs and curriculums for trauma care, and they went and administered them like companies were hiring professionals to come in and provide trauma care to their employees. And actually a lot of people reported that those groups and those therapies actually made it worse, and they were kind of like, we were okay, like, yeah, it was horrible, but we were traumatized by it, and you coming in and making us talk about it and telling us how we're traumatized is making us feel traumatized. So if we're looking for it, we're going to see it, even though it may not be there, and we actually might create some trauma by doing that.
Okay, so the woman up here is Susan Clancy. We'll get back to her in a moment. We'll also get back to the UFO, but yeah, we'll get back. Okay, so I want you to take just 5-10 seconds. Just really kind of absorb this list. I chose some nice social worky words for us. So, yeah. All right, everybody had at least an overview? Okay. We'll get back to that. All right, so Susan Clancy was a graduate student who arrived at Harvard sort of in the middle of a big debate that was brewing in psychiatry, psychology. So at Harvard, there were people like Bessel van der Kolk, who is one of the big trauma guys, one of the big voices. He wrote this, The Body Keeps the Score, very focused on the long-term impact of childhood abuse throughout someone's entire life. Also, the other side of the camp were cognitive psychologists mostly, who were basically contending that repressed memories, which are a feature here, are really not that reliable. They're probably not real most of the time, and basically a traumatic memory is not any more likely to be forgotten than a normal memory or remembered. That memory is memory. And and on this side here, they were saying basically repressed memory. You probably know this. Just the idea is that if you experience trauma as a child, it's so severe that you repress it because you aren't developmentally able to process it at that time. So you forget it until such time as you're safe and able to deal with it later. That was the theory. So Susan Clancy arrived and thought, well, both of these sides are, making their points, but nobody's actually talking to people who are saying that they have survived traumatic events as children. So she started interviewing them. So she tried to develop a test to basically see whether there was actual functional deficits in certain people's memory. Like if people were certain people were prone to have errors in memory more than others. So she came up with this test of semantically related words. She didn't use social work words. And this is not an accurate representation of that test. This is for fun. But anyway, so she would basically ask her subjects to identify which words were on the original list and which weren't. And so certain folks would basically create the memory based on context. And so the test was designed to see, if certain people kind of took outside cues and created memories. So out of curiosity, does anybody see the word that's different? It's a tough one. Hey, yeah, wow, I actually didn't expect anybody to get that, because that's the only word that's different. Yeah, it was activist on the first one, so congrats. All right, so, and her test worked really well. She thought she had some evidence that, in fact, some people are more prone to memory deficits or functional deficits of memory. So she thought she had cracked the nut, but it turns out that people were very unhappy with the idea of her questioning childhood abuse survivors' memories. So she went about trying to find a group of people whose memories basically everyone would agree were false. And so she thought about it and decided to interview a bunch of people who had very strong believed memories that they had been abducted by aliens. So she went and she conducted a full study with these folks and found basically the same results, that certain people were more prone to these functional deficits of memory. And also, before doing this, she had taken a group of people whose childhood abuse was externally verified, so people who, well, just for the sake of argument, were proven to have had childhood abuse. And they all had the results basically all came back that, in fact, some people just are prone to this. So she thought that by doing this test with alien abductees, she would kind of resolve the controversy. Well, it turns out that even people who claim to be abducted by UFOs are very adamant about this. So she got a ton of backlash, even from these folks, after trying to find a group that would not result in backlash. Anyway, so that was her first controversy, or big one, about the idea of repressed memory. She went on to write an even more controversial book called The Trauma Myth. So one of the big things we talked about in this class is having the intellectual courage to stand by your theory as you endeavor to prove it using the scientific process. So she had the courage to do that despite the negative reactions. She endured death threats of sexual assault. People accused her of being a child abuser herself. So the big claims of the trauma myth are, one, that sexual abuse of children is always a heinous crime. She was not contesting that. But the big kind of question she was looking at is, just because a child experiences sexual abuse, do they experience that as trauma as a child? And what she found in interviewing her subjects was that what the predominant experience was actually confusion. And that it was only as adults, as they started to think about these memories in terms of trauma, that they became traumatic. So this kind of sequence here is very big in trauma-informed care, just sort of looking at the biology of the fight and flight and freeze responses. So when a person encounters an event that they do interpret as traumatic, they go into this survival mode. And a big part of trauma-informed care is the idea that if you encounter this as a child, you basically kind of set up a feedback loop that you are always having this same biological response when you even have perceived trauma. So it kind of sets up this expectation that you are always going to be re-traumatized. Oh, I forgot I had little animations. So another possibility is that really it's the response to trauma rather than the event itself that can be traumatic, or that can cause long-term health effects. And then another part of the new way of thinking about this is that it's people who are perhaps genetically predisposed to have the reactivity to the traumatic event, and also people on top of that who are genetically predisposed to have difficulty returning to homeostasis, difficulty re-regulating after the event. So all of those things may also have a genetic link. It's not necessarily just because it happened to an individual that means they're always going to experience these negative biological effects. So as social workers, when we think about somebody using the biopsychosocial model, the trauma-informed care approach typically looks at the long-term effects of the trauma response on a person's health, so sort of the external effects of the event. But it might be helpful for us to start thinking about the potential innate genetic component of it as well, and use that as a starting point for working with somebody, treating them as an individual rather than a cookie cutter trauma survivor, every client we meet. Okay. So to use an anecdotal example to discredit anecdotal examples, I myself once heard a speaker who was sharing about her ritual satanic abuse as a child, and I was horrified by this, right? Obviously. And I'm certainly not here to say that that didn't happen, but I think that learning about the credibility of anecdotal evidence has made me question whether we are doing this type of thing and sort of applying a blanket trauma to a lot of clients that may not be there. And I think the second thing that I've been wondering in putting this presentation together is, well, isn't it better safe than sorry? Shouldn't we, as a default, say that if somebody, has these claims that it's always better safe than sorry to believe them? I'm not here to say that isn't the best, but I started wondering, this woman that I heard, her entire identity is based around this victimization, this trauma. And if in fact that isn't the case, if that was sort of somehow externally imposed on her, then her entire life is driven by a trauma that it might not have to be. So, for what it's worth. And attentional blindness. So like we were saying with the confirmation bias, if we're always looking for trauma, we'll always see trauma. But the other risk is that we'll only see trauma. So I thought that she was in this class, but a classmate of ours had shared a story about a client who came to a group and was very reserved and did not share. And all the staff at the agency assumed that he, if this was you, please let me know. All the staff at the agency assumed that he didn't want to share because he was so traumatized by the subject matter of the group. And then it turned out later on that he just wasn't comfortable with his English skills. And so all the staff missed this really important piece of information about this client because they were focusing only on trauma. So basically, the crux of our message, I think, is just to not always assume that everything is traumatic to everyone, or that that's the primary goal of every client we see. The end. The end.
Okay, great. You guys have covered a lot of ground in that presentation, I think. What questions do we have?
I'm not sure if you would know this, but looking at the definition for trauma in the DSM, it's very similar to adjustment disorder. Do you know if there was a difference in that, or was it just considered trauma? Because it's, with adjustment disorder, it's a stressful event, and then the symptoms after would be depression and stuff. But I was just wondering if the trauma in DSM-3 was kind of confused with affective disorder.
I'm trying to remember the shift from like anxiety disorders to specific. It just I wouldn't be the one to know specifically, but I know there was a shift from 4 to 5 in how they classified those things. That it would have fit the broad range in that early time, I believe.
You know, what's interesting about your point, though, is that, you know, most of the DSM are like internal things, like you have anxiety that comes in you, and in trauma, it's really something that typically that externally happened, and now you have a psychological problem. So it seems like just on the face of it, trauma is really different, you know, and maybe doesn't really fit. So that's part of why it gets confusing. Like, is it anxiety or trauma, or is it, you know, or is it PTSD or trauma, or how do all those things really fit together? And it raises a question about the reliability of knowing about trauma, which you addressed to some extent.
I think what you're pointing out too is that would have been considered trauma at the DSM-3 time, but now it'd be like, you know, so I feel like that's a problem with a lot of things too. You know, now it fits the trauma concept. It's actually kind of got muddled up in everything. So.
There's a problem, like John was showing, that there's these multiple definitions. Even currently, there's multiple definitions. I think the big one between the first, when we saw the stressors, is that now, like adjustment disorder, that's like a typical life event versus with this, you know, like PTSD type disorders, it's an event outside the range of normal human experience. But what does that mean, really? Did you have a question?
Well, when it's out of like your experience, I think it's what's out of your control. Like, you know, you can't expect, like, you can't control what's outside of what's going on around you. You can't control, like, if there's going to be a big horrible car accident that you're going to have to witness, or, you know, those things you can't control for those, you know, but you're more in control in what goes on internally as opposed to externally, and that's how it tends stuff back with the PTSD. It's because they couldn't control what's happening in the external. I think trauma is the exact same way. It's more of an external opposed to an internal.
I think that is an element of current definitions. I think the difference is just whether events that are stressful, that are part of normal life experience, whatever that is, are also out of our control. And so where they become trauma or not might be part of the question.
Well, there is the piece in the definition that says if you've heard about someone close to you having some traumatic event to them and how that affects you. I can't remember exactly how it said it, but that's what it said in like C of the definition. And so that's not outside of you. Do you know what I mean? Like, that's not something happening to you. That's something that you're hearing about. So maybe that's the psychological piece, the internal piece, I guess.
You're internalizing something else and you're taking it on as your own, and that becomes, I think, just as you guys have this up here, is the response to the trauma rather than the trauma itself.
First responders. They say first responders.
Yeah.
Was an example.
Yeah.
So, what were you surprised about? So you looked into this. You hadn't looked into it before. What stood out to you as investigators of this phenomenon?
Nobody questions it
Mm-hmm.
at all. It's like some unspoken law.
Yeah, I think it is really hard to question, and I think your example with woman Clancy, right? Is her name? I mean, it's kind of like a remarkable story, isn't it? I mean, just to try to kind of raise an interesting question about, well, what do we really know about trauma? And in fact, I mean, she just paid this enormous professional price because people just thought, like, she didn't believe in abuse, and she didn't, I mean, all these things that really weren't true. She just raised actually a pretty straightforward question, which is, I wonder how children who are so developmentally young experience something that they can't explain. You know, it's just, you know, she just kind of approached it from a very developmental point of view.
And she had to move. She was at Harvard, I think. Where was she? She lives in Central America now because people were so hostile to her, threatening her.
Yeah.
She doesn't
both professionally and personally. I mean, she was also, like, she had all these terrible personal threats, but she was also told regularly that she was going to be blacklisted from all these academic institutions. She would never get, so I mean, she demonstrated tremendous courage.
So it's just, I mean, we have so little tolerance for critical thinking. We should be able to have an open dialogue, and people should be able to raise these questions, and whether or not, I mean, maybe she's wrong, but, we should be able to just look at it a little bit more clearly. And trauma is such a great example because it's so overwhelming how people think about trauma now. It really is pretty much the explanation for everything.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions from my critical thinkers here?
I like that you all use like the examples. It seem like 3 outdated concepts. If you're going by the DSM-5, none of those apply anymore, which is like blowing my mind right
I think, lots of times we kind of get a little bit lost in something like trauma. We're trying to go back and understand something, which we don't ever understand these things very well. But we do know a little bit more about how to treat them. So if somebody presents with these difficulties, I mean, we have some pretty good ideas about like how to help them, regardless of what we think about what caused it, because it's so hard to really know those explanations about how people develop their symptoms or what's going on with them. But I think it's kind of a cultural thing. I think we just want to try to understand the cause. Anybody want to argue for trauma?
I sort of want to argue for trauma.
Okay.
I'm not exactly, but I came into the program. My background was in like raising community awareness around human trafficking,
Okay.
and trauma is definitely an integral part of the narrative surrounding both domestic and international trafficking. Definitely domestic minor sex trafficking, and I have really struggled throughout the whole program and in putting this presentation together about whether or not I really like having competing values about like believing the victim.
Mm-hmm.
I'm saying the word victim just for the case in point, or not. I mean, when I meet some people who are claiming that they are in the life because they want to be there, my reaction is, yeah, okay, but not really. and is that fair? What is the dominant social work value that I need to be engaging?
So this is a good example because in our school, this controversy is real and alive. So it's a really great example because there's a professor at ASU that studied sex trafficking, and a lot of what she studied was programs that find sex traffickers and then force them into treatment. And a lot of people find that politically unacceptable. So this is kind of really interesting. So for example, Wingspan wrote the whole, I don't know if you've ever seen that. Have you seen their brochure?
It was directed at me.
They actually call out the School of Social Work as engaging in unethical practices because people in the School of Social Work have promoted the way they treat sex trafficking. And it's primarily around self-determination, I think,
Yes,
right?
that's the core controversy, and using like a harm reduction model versus,
I don't understand it all, but I know it's a very intense controversy in the school. The school actually has taken a lot of big hits over this controversy.
I work very closely with her.
Oh, with Dominique?
Yeah.
So, like the School of Social Work in Oregon has written editorials about this. So what do you guys think about that? It's kind of I don't know how to contextualize it in the context of like kind of a post-feminist point of view. Can you articulate that?
No. I think we've been trying for about 10 years to articulate that, and I don't know. But kind of because of this issue, like about everybody's so hyped up in their perspective that I think, like the brochure that you're referring to, I was in a class with the person who composed that. I definitely never mentioned that in fact I helped start the program in Tucson that he was referring to. Definitely not, because I did not have, I guess, the intellectual courage to do that. So I respect that for that person. But I also, I think, respect it from Dominique.
Yeah, so part of the problem always is like the uniformity myth.
Yeah.
So it gets hard. I mean, there may be some people that fit the way you think about their issues and other people that don't for all sorts of different reasons. But instead, I mean, we try to apply these broader explanations to fit everybody. And when we do that, oftentimes we get in trouble. So it may be that there are, different women in different positions coming from different histories, that help us understand and maybe should react to them in different ways.
Yeah. It's room to learn still.
Okay.